Okay, so this is English Intense Review, and as I have been doing with all of the Intense Review class types, we're going to focus on certain things that are either difficult that I get a lot of questions about, or that require a lot of practice, or just important things for you to remember. But we're also going to talk a fair amount about connecting the ideas together. So the things that you did in English 1, and then the things that you did in English 2, and even things you did within those classes, you learned them somewhat individually. So now we're going to connect them together a little bit. And the idea is now you're good at these individual skills, hopefully for the most part. And so now you're really able to start thinking about, well, how can I use the things I know about modifiers or parts of speech, or the conjunction rules that I learned at the very, very beginning? How can I use those to be a little bit better at like sentence structures or something like that? This is technically a review of English 1, 2, and 3. However, a lot of you don't take English 3. That may change in the near future. Again, if you've seen any of my other intense review classes, you know that I kind of reference that I'm at an in-between point as I'm making these. So if you're seeing this video very close to the time that you actually took the classes originally, which right now it's early November 2018. So if you see this within a few months of early November 2018, you probably used the older design of the classes that I'm kind of getting ready to start redesigning and updating. And the skills are the same. So largely I teach everything the same. Updating the program just updates the way things flow or the way that they're put together, tosses an occasional new item in there. So your notes may look a whole lot like this. They may not look like this at all. You have an intense review packet that is specific to this class. And the reason that I started talking about that is, at least right now, and this could change in the future with the redesign that I'm about to start doing, a lot of you don't take English 3. So I kind of restrict English 3 to those of you that want like mid 80s and up, essentially, which is a lot of you, but it's certainly not all of you. So to balance the idea of getting you that review without overwhelming those of you who really aren't going to focus on that content, I'm going to keep the English 3 part of it very simple and on the easier end. So if you didn't take English 3, hopefully between the notes that I've attached into this packet from English 3 and what I say about the more basic instances that we actually do cover here, hopefully you can pick up a little bit of that. If you did take English 3, the packets that you reviewed from English 3 are going to be the more difficult material, so that's still going to be really important to your practice. Some of the examples I've included here are simpler, and there's a lot to be said for going simpler if you've been working on more complicated. So certainly do these exercises, and it might help you round out what you've been working on. I've included a little bit of advanced stuff, not a whole lot. So then once you do this review, you want to just kind of circle back to your original English 3. And again, it's November of 2018. If you're seeing this well into 2019, I may not even have the same class designs or anything. It could all totally be different. So that's kind of a current reference for students who are going to take this soon after it's recorded. So this is the same basic page that you started with as far as learning punctuation. I'm not going to go into tons of detail about punctuation because I don't tend to see issues with that. So once you've taken English 1 and 2, I don't get a lot of questions that are just like, hey, would I put a comma here? I don't see a lot there. So I'm going to focus this class on things I do see a lot of questions on even after the lectures are complete. I'll do a really quick review. There's really not a whole lot as far as the English 1 segment, because we're in the English 1 segment right now, that we do with punctuation. We essentially do commas, semicolons, and colons. So you've got a page that's devoted to colons, followed by a page devoted to semicolons, and then extraneous usages, which this is part of commas, and you know that now that you've done the initial lectures over that. And then later we'll do like quotes and apostrophes and stuff like that. So as far as just your really basic core grammar skills, the commas are going to be really important. So we use commas in basically 2 ways. We use them when we're doing a list, and we use them when we have some sort of conjunction. And another way of talking about having some sort of conjunction is having a dependent and an independent clause. And hopefully by now you've worked a fair amount on your English and you're familiar with this as an issue, and how these things connect. So when I say conjunction and when I say dependent clauses, hopefully now you really bridge those two ideas together in your head. And if you don't, hopefully what we're about to look at will help you do that. So a conjunction is a specific word, and it really isn't a specific word in another sense. So we very much learned this as, you know, here's these lists of conjunctions. You have your coordinate conjunctions like but and or and so. And then you have your subordinate, which is like, it could be almost anything, before or after, because, however, for example. There's tons and tons of these. That's not even a good example list because there's so many of them. When you think about those conjunctions, though, you should also immediately realize that that means you have a dependent clause. So you essentially can't have a conjunction appear without in some way having a dependent clause, unless you are dealing with a simple sentence, which largely is not what you're going to be dealing with unless you're actually answering a question that says, what is the simple sentence? So you want to be aware of these ideas on two different levels. You definitely need to be aware of conjunctions first and foremost. Be aware of when you spot conjunctions in sentences. It's great if you can be aware right off the bat of, oh, this is a coordinate conjunction, this is a subordinate. But really the key here is just the fact that you should be noticing instantly if there is a conjunction in a sentence. That should be something you immediately notice and realize. And then you should also be aware of what that means. And it doesn't always mean the same thing. So we're going to say what that means instead of giving it a particular name. And so essentially what I'm asking you to be aware of here is, how does the conjunction affect the sentence? And I mean that from two perspectives. How does it affect the sentence as far as like punctuation, structure? And how does it affect what the sentence actually says and what the content is, how something is emphasized? And I listed out a couple things on my paper version here that I'm going to list here in a second, that conjunctions have to do with. So I guess on this first page, if there's a takeaway that I want you to get on this first page, it's all the effects that conjunctions have. So you want to be very aware of when you run across a conjunction, and then in turn very aware of how that conjunction you just ran across is actually ending up functioning. So we're on the commas page. So how do conjunctions relate to commas? Typically when you have a conjunction, especially a subordinate conjunction. So if you have a subordinate conjunction, those are the bigger ones in many instances, there is always going to be a comma. Always, always, always going to be a comma if you have a subordinate conjunction. With most coordinate conjunctions, you will also have a comma. The difference is with a coordinate conjunction, you actually could have a simple sentence structure where there's not another subject, and that could cause the two to stay together. Subordinate conjunctions continue to focus on knowing what those are, but there's no way to know them all. So make sure you're looking for this function. So in addition to knowing what the list of conjunctions is as much as possible, also look for something that is functioning in this way. If you start out any sentence with a word that essentially causes it to be tentative in some way. So if you start a sentence with the word after, or you start a sentence with the word in, or per our example right up here above, you start a sentence with having. This will immediately impact the fact that there will be a comma, and it will impact the fact that there is going to be an independent clause and there is going to be a dependent clause. So let's fill this in with any random content. Let's say after I left for work. So if I use the word after at the beginning of that sentence, then I definitely have to have another clause. I definitely cannot put a period there and end my sentence. Why I can't end my sentence here is because of the conjunction. Because if the conjunction weren't there, it would say, I left for work. That's a short sentence, but it is a sentence because it has all the information required for a sentence. When I start with this word after, now I'm clearly putting an emphasis somewhere else. So by putting the word after right there, it goes from you as the reader thinking that I'm telling you I left for work to now you as the reader thinking that's not my point. The fact I did leave for work is not my point. My point is going to be whatever happened after that. So after I left for work, there's going to be a comma there. That comma goes directly with that word after. I stopped at the store. And again, it could be anything. I'm just making these up. You'll notice a lot of my sentences have the same kind of idea behind them over and over because I'm not that creative of a person. So you'll see a lot of, I left for work, I stopped at the store, after and before I did this, I looked for this and that. But you can make these up, and that's actually a really good thing to do. So if you can just take a big list of conjunctions, maybe write them out on a piece of paper and then form these sentences, that will help you specifically see the independent and the dependent clauses. And that's the key, is being able to spot a conjunction and then being able to say, well, if that conjunction is right there, then this one is now a dependent clause. I left for work would have been independent. Now we're dealing with a dependent clause because of the word after. Over here, I stopped at the store is what's following our comma. You could just say I stopped at the store. So this would be our independent. This particular sentence is a complex sentence. And that's where I want to join these ideas together. If you're not quite there on knowing why I just said that, and if you haven't recognized that, or if you don't recognize that and you're like, whoa, 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 hold on, what do you mean it's complex? Don't focus on that yet, I guess would be my suggestion. But hopefully you are at this point. You know that a complex sentence is identified with a subordinate clause. So now we can begin to think about the fact that a complex sentence will always have this type of structure, and it will always have this type of punctuation. So there's very few instances where you could use a subordinate conjunction and not wind up having a comma in between a dependent and an independent clause. So let's look at this another way. If I have a complex sentence, and complex sentence, what I'm referencing there is what we did in English 2, where we did simple, compound, and complex, and we used that very specific 3 or 4 step process to identify those. So if I have a complex sentence, I have a couple of things that I know for sure. I know I have a subordinate conjunction. It's impossible to have a complex sentence without a subordinate conjunction. If I have a subordinate conjunction, I also have a comma, and that comma separates an independent from a dependent clause. You have one clause that can stand on its own, and then you have one that can't. The one that can't, the dependent clause, that's where the conjunction is located. Hopefully, the way that you've been practicing and paying attention to these different components, that makes total sense to you now, and you're able to just join English 1 and 2 that easily together. That's how English 1 and 2 join, because in English 1, we're thinking about, the comma, is the comma right? We're thinking about, does the sentence make sense the way that they've worded it? And then in English 2, we're thinking about what structure is that sentence. So now we've determined, yes, this is a sentence. It's put together properly. It's got a comma where it's supposed to. It's got this type of clause and that type of clause. And then English 2 is where we start to bridge over to that means it's complex or that means it's compound. Let's do a couple more examples with the commas. So in is an interesting conjunction. I'm using that one because this class is a bit more advanced. There's two of them that are easy to miss, which is as and in. There are others that are also easy to miss. These are so tiny that they don't jump out as being a conjunction. And it's not even obvious the way that they function as a conjunction. So let's use as. And remember with subordinate conjunctions, they can appear at the beginning or in the middle of the sentence. So subordinate conjunctions could be at the beginning of a sentence or they could be in the middle. So let's do as, and I'll move in down here so we don't forget to do that. So with as, let's do one that it's at the beginning. Let's do one that it's in the middle. So let's say as I left for work, we'll stay with the same boring content here. As I left for work. And again, now we can see here that this is functioning as a conjunction. The fact it's at the beginning of the sentence, so any word that is in the very first space in a sentence, anytime it's the first word in a sentence, it has to be subordinate. It can't be coordinate. So as I left for work, clearly I can't stop and put my period here. And the reason that I can't stop and put my period here is the word as implies, and let's think about what it implies. So me saying as I left for work implies something else happened, something besides leaving for work. So my point, when I put a conjunction at the beginning of the sentence, what I immediately do in terms of what I'm relating to my reader is I immediately point out the fact that I'm not focused on that. I'm not just trying to tell you I left for work. If I was, I would just say I left for work. I'd put a period there, and that would be a simple sentence. As I left for work says something else happened. That would make this now a dependent clause. This clause cannot exist by itself because it has a conjunction in it. So let's say my mom called me. I could just say my mom called me. That is standing on its own. That makes this an independent clause. The word as functions as giving a reason or a time reference. So in this case, it's time because I'm saying as I left for work, meaning at the same time that I left for work, my mom also called me. These two events happened at the same time. Let's do one where it's in the middle. Let's say I left for work early. We'll keep them as similar as we can. I left for work early. Now I haven't put the conjunction in yet, so we'll just analyze this as its own little frame. I left for work early. That is independent. I could stop there, no problem, and have a simple sentence with no conjunction and nothing else. And if I did that, then the point that I would be trying to make is just that I did leave for work early. If that's not my point, then I can modify, and again, we're going to use as. So I could also put as right here, and again, there's going to be a comma because, again, there's going to be an independent and a dependent clause because of the presence of this word. This time, though, the dependent is going to be the second clause, but similarly to the first situation, the dependent clause is the one the conjunction is in. So in this case, as, instead of giving time, so here we were using as like at the same time. Here we're going to be giving reason. We're going to be giving an explanation for something. So as is functioning here as saying, here's my reason for doing this. I left for work early as I had to get gas. We'll make that our sentence. So now instead of my point being that I left for work early, my point is I had to get gas. This is dependent because of the word as. Had the word as not been there, that would actually be independent, because you could just say I had to get gas, and you could just say I left for work, and you could just say I left for work early. But the point that the person writing the sentence here is trying to make is I left for work early because I needed to get gas. Speaking of because, so there's two usages of as in the first slot or as in the middle slot. This could also be a lot of other words, right? So it could be because, it could be the word since. And those are all in the reason category. So if you haven't done a lot yet with just kind of looking at conjunctions in different situations and thinking about how they are specifically functioning, that's a great thing to do. Lots of conjunctions have more than one way that they work. Because is one of them that has one way. You can only use the word because for one key thing, and that's giving a reason, giving an explanation. You can use as to say these two timelines are happening. As this one thing is happening, so is this other. You can use it as a reason. I'm doing this as I need to also do that. And it's good to think about that in the context of sentences. So don't memorize anything. I've always said that if you're up to this point, you've been in my classes for a while, you're pretty familiar with what my general kind of mantras are. And one of my biggest things is don't memorize anything, because it's not an effective way to use the material on the test. So you want to look in a sentence, and you want to think with all these examples that I've included in this packet here, you just want to think, what can I find out about each one of these sentences? Can I look at a conjunction and determine how it's functioning and get some practice with that? Can I look at the modifiers and determine how and why one of them is misplaced because I have this example in front of me, and then get more experience with that? So commas are used for basically this separation of an independent and a dependent clause. You're going to see a conjunction when that happens, or they're used in a list. And remember that lists that have commas are specifically lists that have 3 or more items, not 2 items. So if I say party and dance, for example, from class, that is just 2 items. There is no comma. If I say party, dance, and coffee shop, then now we have 3 items, and we have to have commas in between them. One of the questions that I have gotten, and we did address this very specifically in class, so you haven't missed anything if you already know this, is we do put a comma before the word and. We always put a comma after the final item that precedes the word and. So always, always there needs to be a comma there. Something I pointed out in class that I'll emphasize a bit less right now is that you can have items that join within a list, or you can have something that, because of the way it's named, might have the word and that would not count as separate items. So this sentence right here, same example that we looked at in the original class, I need to go to the store to get water, sugar, and flour. These are like one thing. They're essentially saying these are one thing. And then yogurt. I could also have done water, comma, sugar, comma, flour, comma, and yogurt. So it's a stylistic decision to decide to join those items together, feeling like they're similar enough that they're not separate items in the list. What I'm pointing out in pointing out that that is a stylistic decision is they could not make you pick between them. So they can't make you pick between having it worded this way right here and having the same thing, but having water, sugar, flour, yogurt. They cannot make you pick between those. There's not a right answer to that. The only thing I want to remind you of as you're reviewing is that this is a possibility, and you would pick that if these 2 items were like items in some way, were part of something together, or were very similar, and all the other answer choices are definitely wrong. So just remember that it could look that way. Before we go on in punctuation, let's do a couple of compound sentences joining up with English 2 again. And so a coordinate conjunction is what we find. And remember, coordinate conjunctions are not exclusive to compound sentences. They can be found in simple or compound. So you have something very unique with the fact that a subordinate clause is an absolute dead giveaway that it is a complex sentence structure. This is unique. Keep that very, very close to your central skills that you're using in your thought processes, because that is so helpful. And then keep in mind that the other conjunction type, and the coordinates are the little ones. You've got but, and, and or as your three primary ones. And then there's like so, for, nor, and yet. You have these listed in your English 2 stuff coming up. And those can be found in multiple instances. We're going to look at them from a compound standpoint right now, and then I'll toss in a little bit of knowledge about simple. And we're largely going through some of the things that I have intended for the English 2 section as well. So we're kind of taking this from an advanced standpoint already. So let's say I would have left early. We'll stay with the same content. I would have left early, but I had to get ready, let's say. So again, when we have I would have left early, but I had to get ready, we now have a dependent and an independent. But I had to get ready. Basically, anytime that you've got a conjunction in a certain half of the sentence, that's always going to cause that half to be dependent. Because I have the word but there, I can't just say, but I had to get ready, because then it's like, what does the but go with? If I just said I had to get ready, that would be no problem. So anywhere that you see a conjunction in a half of a sentence makes that part of the sentence dependent. I would have left early is independent. And I realize that this is kind of one of those, and there's a lot of them that are this way, that feel a little questionable. So I'm going to take a moment to point out something. We always identify an independent and a dependent clause. Thankfully, in the context of entrance exams, they don't do much with having multiple, dependents together or having multiple independents. There are a couple of instances of those that I'll be pointing out soon. But for the most part, everything you're going to kind of deal with is going to have like an independent and a dependent, or it might just be independent and there is no other clause, period, where you just have, for example, I went to work early. This is a simple sentence, and a simple sentence is defined as just one independent clause. So what we're going to be dealing with is having an independent and a dependent clause in a sentence, or having just an independent clause in a sentence. And then keeping in mind that you always need to recognize that those are both present, keeping in mind that you always need to identify your conjunction. And then once you've identified your conjunction, you know where your dependent is, and then you can check the other side and make sure it's independent. What's funky about this example is that you might read this first part and you might ask yourself, is that actually independent? Because if I just walked up to someone and said, I would have left early, that doesn't exactly make sense to them, right? So if someone doesn't have context, if we don't have this other half of the sentence, or if we don't have another nearby sentence, then you wouldn't know what I'm talking about. And the another nearby sentence is the crucial point of this, because yes, this is independent. It has a subject, it has a verb, and it has a complete thought. So the definition of a independent clause is something that's got a subject, a verb that the subject is doing, and a complete thought. That's what makes the difference between something being independent and something being a fragment. However, to be independent does not mean that you can't be in need of a nearby sentence, if that makes sense. So some of your independent clauses are going to seem very independent. I left for work early, you could just walk up to someone and say that. Some of them occasionally will challenge you because they'll seem like, well, that is a sentence. It's not like it's a fragment that just dropped off and just vanished, but you would need to have a bit more information for it to make sense. In this case, yes, you could say I would have left early, but at some point, either before that or after that, you'll have to sort of explain what happened that caused you not to leave early, because that is still a concept that's needed with that fragment. A fragment is obvious. So if something is truly a fragment, it's like the woman in the red dress. It's something that you can see just falls off. The woman in the red dress does not have a subject, a verb, and a complete thought, because it says the woman and then doesn't say anything about her. So let me make a quick check here. I have several notes on this first page, and I want to make sure as I'm erasing that I didn't miss any of my key points. So I will reiterate something that we just worked on. Essentially what I have written here to let you in on what my major focuses were with this first couple pages is understanding that conjunctions affect several things. So conjunctions affect punctuation is our big point right now. How do conjunctions affect punctuation? Typically with a comma, and that comma being between an independent and a dependent. They also affect sentence structure. Again, we just discussed that because we discussed complex and compound versus simple. So if you have a conjunction, it doesn't necessarily just automatically mean you have some certain type of structure, but having a conjunction will certainly affect how we evaluate the structure of the sentence in terms of simple, compound, complex. It also affects what order things are said in. So if I'm going to use the word as, then that's going to affect where I put the rest of what I'm trying to say. If I'm going to put because, again, that affects where I'm going to put something, because my reasoning needs to go with because, and then whatever introduces that reasoning needs to not be with because and be ahead of it. And then it also affects things down the road, like subject-verb agreement, and things like parts of speech. So something that we talked about and will talk about again is instances where they ask you for like the subject of a sentence, and maybe that sentence starts out with a conjunction, and all of a sudden, not only does the sentence look different, not only do we assign a different structure name to it, we also have a subject that is now shifted and it's found in a different place. So we really want to be aware of conjunctions and something that I'm going to nickname conjunction functions. And I'm totally not trying to be funny with that, but you will probably remember it since we like things that rhyme. What I mean by conjunction functions is something that's going to come up soon in an example. Conjunction function is essentially the idea that anything, if placed correctly, and I'm going to put right because I have less room than I would like to have. So anything, if placed right, can operate as a conjunction. And that is a very important concept to keep in mind. Anything that is placed in the right spot could actually cause a dependent clause to occur, even if it's not because or however or as. And that's essentially what I wanted to cover as far as the first page. We're going to go off and sidestep a little bit, and then we'll end up coming back to a lot more of this when we go to talk about these in terms of their examples. So just remember that conjunctions are super important. My big arching concept, the big thing I'm trying to bridge together here is conjunctions affect everything you did in English 1, and they affect everything you did in English 2. And we talked about them in both of those classes, What we didn't do in those classes is really join them together and think about the English 2 concepts at the same time as the English 1 concepts. All of that centers on conjunctions. So if you're very aware of conjunctions, you're working hard on recognizing them and seeing how they're being used, you're going to be able to just identify all kinds of information about a sentence from all of your different English classes. Quick couple of things on punctuation before we go back to that concept. A colon is not something you're going to see very often. You probably will not see a colon on your test. This is not a common thing. It is important you know how it's used because maybe it'll be one of your wrong answers somewhere, or maybe you actually could get asked about it. A colon introduces an item or it introduces a series of items. A better way to think of a colon is that it introduces a list. So if you're going to list something without like introducing it, so if you're going to say, you know, you may be required to bring many things, and then instead of having to say such as or the things that you need are, you can use a colon to give yourself permission to just throw a list in there. So that's the only usage of a colon. So if you see a colon in your answer choices, the most likely way you're going to encounter this is it's one of your wrong answers, and you need to be able to determine that it is in fact wrong. So it's wrong if it's not doing this. A colon would be the wrong thing to use if there is no list. I'll put wrong if over here. Definitely organize your notes better than what I'm doing here. So it would be wrong if there's no list, or there is a list, but it's introduced in some other way. So it's introduced already. That example, and you might remember it from class, is when we say like such as. So you may be required to bring many things, such as. That would take away the need for a colon. So remember that a colon and an expression like such as are the same thing. So that would be like saying and. To have a colon and a such as would be like saying and, or but. We don't want to do that. So a colon would be a wrong usage if there was no list, or the list wasn't in the spot where the colon is. It wasn't introduced there. Or the list already has a transitional introduction. A conjunction is what would do that. So that would also, again, be the presence of a conjunction. Almost everything you do is heavily dependent on conjunctions. So that's colons. Semicolons join two sentences together. And now I'm going to start to relate this again to something that has to do with the sentence structures and something that bridges the first two classes together. A semicolon is used when you have like two completely independent sentences that could totally, in the exact form that you are seeing them in front of you, could be two sentences. So there's two ways to bring together two thoughts. You could say, call me tomorrow, end the sentence and start up a new one, and say, you can give me an answer then. Those are each sentences. They're short, and that's usually when you will see someone decide they want to use a semicolon, is when an answer or a couple of sentences, each of the sentences is short, so it doesn't necessarily need to be broken up with periods. So these two things are exactly identical. There's one big crucial difference. There's a semicolon in one of them. There's a period in the other. If you do use a semicolon, you are joining two sentences together, which means you're not going to capitalize the second sentence because you're bringing them together. So something to think about with a semicolon, when you go to identify, and again, you're just going to see semicolons as possible answer choices. So you're going to see them brought up when you're doing like a decision on where to put commas or something like that. So when they say which is, you know, punctuated clearly or which is punctuated correctly, one of your answer choices could very well have a semicolon. What you want to identify is at the spot where the semicolon is parked, could I put a period there and have two sentences without removing anything, without adding anything, without restructuring anything? You can legit just take the semicolon out, put a period in, fix the capitalization of that next letter, and you have two sentences. If that's the case, the semicolon is being used correctly. If that is not the case, then it's not being used correctly. Just like I said in the other classes, and I'll probably end up revising these fairly soon, this part you don't need to worry about. Don't worry about where I'm talking about certain conjunctions because that doesn't come up. Same thing right here on the page right before this, where I have the bold print and then I have the red writing. Don't worry about that either. So when you're identifying semicolons, you're basically just deciding, is this answer choice that they put a semicolon in correct, or is this answer choice incorrect? Which of course is based on, is the semicolon being used right, or is the semicolon being used wrong? Something this connects to that can actually make your life a lot easier is what kind of sentence structure has to be in place to see a semicolon. There's actually a direct causation here. Just like when I say, oh, if you see a subordinate, you definitely have a complex sentence. If you see a subordinate conjunction, you definitely have a complex sentence. If you see a semicolon, you definitely have a compound sentence. We're about to go into sentence structures. So you have notes coming up that remind you of what exactly the definition is of these two things. But a compound sentence is two simple sentences, two independent clauses. So to say simple sentence is exactly the same thing as to say independent clause. So a simple sentence, when we actually identify a simple sentence, is just one independent clause. A compound sentence is when we have two different independent clauses and they're joined together, because we're talking about a sentence, not sentences. But a compound can be joined two ways. The way that we focused on in class is joined by a coordinate conjunction. So if you have two sentences and in between them you place a coordinate conjunction, then you have a compound. The other thing they can be joined by, though, is instead of actually adding that coordinate conjunction, you could just have a semicolon. So to bring together two simple sentences, you would either have to put an and or a but or an or you would have to put a semicolon. The definition of subordinate, just while we're here, is to have one independent and one dependent. So if you have an independent clause joined to a dependent clause and it contains a subordinate conjunction in one of those two clauses, either at the very beginning or right in the middle, then you have a complex. If you have two simple sentences brought together either with a semicolon between them where they truly are two independent sentences, or with a conjunction added to them to split them up and bring them into one sentence, then you have a compound. A simple sentence is just an independent clause. Remember that a simple sentence can, in fact, have the presence of a coordinate conjunction. We do have this coming up. I am skipping around because by now you're able to hold these thoughts all at the same time and use them to boost each other, and that is the goal of this class, but we will go through that again in a moment. And then remember extraneous usages. And again, this isn't something you're going to see a whole lot of. Mostly when they want you to mess with commas, what they want you to mess with is, here's a sentence that starts with a conjunction. And that's going to mean instantly, as soon as we see that we have started up a sentence using a conjunction, we know that there's going to be a comma here to separate an independent clause from this dependent clause that has the conjunction. That's usually how you're going to do these really basic punctuation questions. That said, if you ever see that there's two commas in a sentence, and that they're surrounding some sort of fragment within the sentence, remember that 2 commas, so something being surrounded by commas, means that whatever that something is, whatever words are between those commas, they are extraneous. Unless, of course, it's a list. That's a different situation. Extraneous is not irrelevant and totally pointless. If you think of it that way, you'll miss some opportunities, but it's not crucial. So I can just say, while I was at Starbucks, I ordered a cinnamon latte, have 1 comma in between there to make it punctuated for this word while. And then you got my point. I made a complete statement. But if I want to add something in, I can say, while I was at Starbucks, my favorite coffee shop, but I have to surround that by commas to say this doesn't have to be here. You can use that for one of 2 things. There could actually be a situation, they're pretty limited, so you probably won't have this happen, but they could actually ask you to correctly punctuate something that does in fact have extraneous information in it. So if you spot that there is an extraneous phrase in something, they could ask you, what are you supposed to do because there is that extraneous phrase? Of course, they're not going to point it out to you. You're going to have to realize that something in the sentence is extra. And then they might ask you how you would punctuate that, which is, of course, to surround it usually with commas, although remember, these are also usages. There's dashes that work that way, commas, ellipses, or parentheses. You're typically going to see the 2 commas. The more common place you're going to see this is you're trying to correctly punctuate something that has commas, like something that starts with while, or something that right smack in the middle has because, or it has however. So when you're trying to just punctuate something because it's a complex sentence and it needs a comma, or it's a compound sentence and it needs a comma, you may run into something that has extraneous punctuation being used when it shouldn't be. So if a fragment is surrounded by commas, that fragment must be something that can just be yanked right out of there and it doesn't affect the sentence. If it does affect the sentence to yank the fragment out of there, then there should not be commas surrounding it. I strongly encourage you, we're about to look at some practice over punctuation and clarity, but I encourage you to also use your practices and your notes from your previous class, because there are essentially different types of examples that are being focused on. So there are several instances in the original classes where I actually pointed these out. I will point them out again, but as you're practicing your new content, your new practice, also continue to look back at your old practice. I strongly recommend, if you get a lot out of the way that I'm kind of joining these concepts together now, that's the whole point of the intense review class, is to bring the classes together as though you learned all of it at once instead of in small pieces. If you're getting a lot out of that and you're like, wow, this is actually better for me, I like it better when I can look at a sentence and see all the English 2 properties and all the English 1 properties at the same time, go back, reprint your old practices and practice them with that new joined mentality. If you still prefer to think of your stuff sort of separately and you still prefer to address an English 1 question just in that manner and an English 2 only in that manner, then you may or may not benefit from reprinting and repracticing. You never want to keep practicing something if you remember it and you're getting to where you're just memorizing it. Most of you, I would say, can probably use an exercise twice before that happens. Very few of you can probably use an exercise a 3rd time. Typically, by the time you see a certain question for a 3rd time, you're answering it because you remember the answer. Some of you might only be able to see a question once. If you're going to remember the questions that you saw from your classes, that might not be as effective. If you reprint them and you do remember the questions, but you're using a different thought process and a different way of getting to your answer, that's beneficial even if you actually might remember the answer. So this is going to look a lot like English 1. I did a little bit better of a job of actually splitting the two things that are in this exercise. So you'll notice that the first page, they all say which is correct. They're all just punctuation correctness questions. And then starting on the second page, we switch to clarity, where we're deciding how to arrange the sentences. And you may want to label if you're not as good at spotting this. So when it says which is correct, and they can use their wordings on their questions however they want. So you can never assume just because they ask a question, you know, using the word correct, you can't assume that they don't have any other elements to it. So for something to be correct, correct is a huge umbrella term. I could say correct to mean pretty much any concept that we've talked about all throughout the English. So you have to make sure you're looking for the other indicators, which we're about to go through. But generally speaking, when you just see like which sentence is correct, you're going to notice that they're basically asking you where to place things like commas and semicolons. The next couple of pages are clarity. And that's when they ask you what's the clearest. So clarity and fluency are the two ways that they name that. Those are asking you how to arrange the words to get your point across in the clearest manner. So even though these are always combined into one exercise together, it is important to discern between the two. How I can very easily tell which thing I have in front of me. I'm going to get an example from each page visible here. So if you look at 6 and 7 on my screen, when I see which of the following is most correct, I also notice that these sentences are exactly the same. There is no difference in how the wordings look. They all line up with each other, other than there's a little extra something there. There's a semicolon versus a comma versus no punctuation. When you look at one that is a clarity question, you'll notice that they don't line up. They all have different wordings in different places. They're still going to be the same length, so you do have to like look kind of carefully to determine, do I have the same sentence 4 times, just not punctuated the same, or do I have similar sentences, but they aren't worded the same? So always look for the wording of the question and then look at your answer choices to ensure you're thinking down the right path. If we look at number 1, which sentence is correct? This is the example that I promised a few minutes ago, where the word considering is not really in like a technical capacity considered a conjunction. So this is where I mentioned to you and promised that we had an example coming up. Anything can function as a conjunction if it's parked in the right place and used in the right way. So by putting the word considering at the front of this sentence, I am shifting where the point is going to be made within the sentence. That's what a conjunction always does when we're thinking about, you know, where the subject is located, when we're thinking about where to put a comma, when we're thinking about whether or not something is actually a conjunction. What we're thinking about is, am I shifting where my focus is? Using the word considering at the beginning of this sentence makes it where this the first clause, considering her current career, is obviously not the point. Her current career is not the point. And I know that because they put the word considering. So considering her current career, there's going to be some other big point. Considering is not a conjunction, or at least I wouldn't think of it as a conjunction, but in this case, leading into a sentence like this, I can see that the point is going to be made over here after the comma because of the word considering and how it's being used. So considering her current career, Mary has an unusual background. Anytime I have a subordinate conjunction functioning up at the front of a sentence, that's always going to shift my point. It's always going to cause the first part where that's located to be a dependent clause. generally speaking, that's going to mean my other clause is independent. So I could just say Mary has an unusual background, and that would be a complete thought. I could not just say considering her current career and then stop speaking there, because you wouldn't know what I was getting at. If I have a dependent clause at the front of the sentence and I have an independent clause right after it, there's going to be one punctuation that's used, and that's going to be the comma that is always present to separate an independent and a dependent clause from one another. So when you have a conjunction that's at the beginning of the sentence, you have to determine where does that first thought end and where does the second independent thought begin. That's where you're going to put the comma. If the conjunction is in the middle of the sentence, then the comma goes right ahead of the conjunction. So that one is going to be A. Number 2, before answering the final question on the reading exam, Jewel checked her answers for the section. So again, I can see that I'm just dealing with punctuation because all of this is worded in the exact same manner. The only differences between these different answer choices is just where I put the commas or whether I put a semicolon or a colon or something like that. Before is a subordinate conjunction. A lot of words that are subordinate conjunctions can be used in another context that isn't a conjunction. The word before is in your lists of subordinate conjunctions. That is usually used in a conjunction format. That said, you can use the word before and not actually be using it as a conjunction. You couldn't do that with putting it right in the front of the sentence like we did here, because we clearly, by saying before answering the final question, we're clearly not making a point out of answering the final question. We're making a point out of whatever comes over here. So what did she do before she answered the final question on her reading test? And again, this is just an absolutely classic case where we start with a conjunction. So we need to put a comma at the end of that first thought, at the end of that dependent clause. There is no indication here for any other punctuation placed anywhere else. So we don't want these ones that have extra commas. We don't want one that has no comma, because we always need to have a comma if there's a dependent and an independent together. So B would be out because it's got no punctuation. C is a good example of where an extraneous is being used, and that can kind of give you a heads up. If you chose C, you would be saying that this part right here that's surrounded by commas is not important. So you'd be saying before answering the final question, Jewel checked her answers for the section. And that does actually make sense. So you could actually remove that fragment in this case. However, on the reading exam is part of this first primary thought. That's not a situation. If I'm speaking this sentence, I'm not saying before answering the final question on the reading exam, Jewel checked her answers for the section. So this is not said as an extra comment. It's part of that first part. And how you avoid confusion if you do run into a situation where something actually does technically fit the rules is you think about the overarching thing that you are looking for. What we're really trying to do here is get that comma in the middle, because we have a subordinate conjunction leading us off with a dependent thought and then bringing us on to our independent thought. So just like all the others that look like this, this is going to have a comma right here and nowhere else. So the only place we need a comma is between the dependent clause at the beginning and the independent clause that comes after that. Something to keep in mind with a situation like C. When you do an extraneous, so not only do you have to fit the qualification of this doesn't have to be said, you also will end up with a pause right here and right here. Anytime that something has a comma, don't care how many commas, don't care where the comma, there is a pause. That's what a comma does, right? That's probably the very first thing that you learned about commas long, long ago. So remember to read it that way before you confirm it. If you were kind of stuck between A and C because you looked at A and you said, well, that's typically how we punctuate this. And then you looked at C and you said, well, wait a second. Technically, on the reading exam actually could be extraneous because that's not totally critical information. You don't have to say it's on the reading exam. You can just say it's the final question. But then go back and read it that way and decide, is the author of the sentence, is their intent to actually say it that way? Are they using it in an extraneous format? So like if we go back to what our extraneous was up here, while I was at Starbucks, my favorite coffee shop, I ordered a cinnamon latte. I'm not trying to blend that extraneous into what comes before it. So I'm not trying to say this like, while I was at Starbucks, my favorite coffee shop, I ordered a cinnamon latte. I am pausing here, and I am pausing here, and I am essentially inserting a comment. So there's a comment that I am inserting by having those commas that way. Is that what we would want this to sound like on question 2 on our new exercise? Let's determine that. Before answering the final question on the reading exam, Jewel checked her answers for the section. That's not the way the author's trying to say the sentence. The author's just trying to say, before answering the final question on the reading exam, Jewel checked her answers for the section. So there's always a double check. Keep in mind another thing, and this is something I will point out a few more times as we go here. There are certain things that the T's and the HESI, particularly the T's is so easy for me to pinpoint. There are certain questions they ask, and there are many, many, many other questions that they don't. And I get that question a lot. I'll have somebody send me a message and say, hey, here's the question that I have. How come, you don't talk about Oxford commas? How come you don't talk about these other usages of commas and these other usages of semicolons and all this extra stuff? So people who are extremely familiar with grammar often ask why I'm missing so much out of my content. And that is simply, there are certain things that they do and don't use. This idea of having the idea that's behind both of these questions of having a dependent clause with a conjunction and having an independent clause that either follows it or precedes it and having a comma between those two clauses, that's what they're going for there. That's what they're trying to test. They're not going to try to test whether you can point out that this could or could not be extraneous, because that's not their goal in one of these questions. So unless something is definitely extraneous, definitely needs to be separated out in order for it to make sense, you don't have to be focused on that concept. All you need as far as extraneous commas is just to be aware of what they are and why they exist and what they do, so that you can keep an eye out. I'm going to do 2 more that are on this page. Actually, I'm going to do 2 more on this page, and then the rest of this page is your practice. One of them is 4. So when Julie has a quiz or test, she stays home to study the night before. The word when is another one of those examples where I would consider the word when to be a conjunction, but it can certainly be used not as a conjunction. Same thing with before. So I think of before, after, and when as being ultimately conjunctions, but I am aware that they can be used in a way that they're not actually in a conjunction spot. That said, when we see it at the beginning of a sentence like this, it's definitely a conjunction. So here, when Julie has a quiz or test, makes it apparent to us as the reader of the sentence that the point isn't her having a quiz or test. The point is when she has one of those, something else happens. So that something else is she stays home to study the night before. So when Julie has a quiz or test, she stays home to study the night before. Again, there's just one comma that we need here. The one that splits up the when she has this or that, she does this or that. That's going to go right there. The reason that I picked this as one of the ones that we talk about and look at is because ultimately, there is kind of like a little list in here, which is the quiz or test. So remember that it's a list whether we say and or whether we say or. So if we said quiz and test or quiz or test, that functions exactly the same way. What I'm pointing out here is that's only 2 items. So we don't put these commas here like they did in the last couple of answer choices, because we don't actually need to split them. So we don't split up quiz or test because quiz and test is just one little part of the sentence. So this is going to be A, which is the one that just has the comma that's separating the 2 clauses. The other one I'm going to look at is 6, and I'm not actually going to do 6 because I want you to have 6 as a practice. So I'm just going to point something out. When you see a semicolon, and I guess I could have pointed this out earlier because I think one of our other questions that we just did had a semicolon. When you see a semicolon, there's a very easy and important thing that you should do. You should evaluate whether it's used correctly or incorrectly. So when you see a semicolon, you just need to do one major thing. Determine whether it is one sentence or 2 sentences. In other words, determine right here when I see that I have a semicolon, I need to establish, are these 2 different sentences that are just being brought together, or are they not? If there is a conjunction in the sentence, a semicolon does not work. So remember what, write this out like this. Remember what a semicolon does. It brings together 2 completely independent sentences, and instead of having a period between them where they're literally 2 sentences, it just has a semicolon and joins them together. If I have 2 independent clauses, if I have 2 independent sentences like that, then it's very important to note that it would be impossible to have a conjunction. What a conjunction causes is it causes a dependent clause. If there is a dependent clause present, then you cannot have a semicolon because a semicolon joins together 2 independent clauses. So the presence of a conjunction indicates the presence of a dependent clause, which also indicates a comma. The presence of a semicolon indicates 2 independent clauses, which indicates that we would not have the presence of a conjunction. The next section is going to be the clarity section. And there's a few types of clarity questions, I guess, that I wanted to point out here. Clarity is the section that is the most difficult for many of you. This is kind of where we have those modifiers and we're kind of trying to organize how the different modifiers go together. We're organizing the way we word something. So we're wording something in a way that ensures everything is as clearly stated as it can possibly be. Something I do want to note here, and this spans everything on your test. I say it all the time. I am not saying this for English right now. I'm saying it for everything. It depends on your choices. There are instances where you are prepared to answer with the absolute best answer that could possibly ever be answered for a particular question. You've got it in your head. You know what it is. It's there. And it's like no contest with any of the other choices. There's other situations where there's not a perfect answer actually sitting there. And that gets a lot more complicated. That's where I say it depends on choices. Even with science, even as clear-cut as science is, There's a lot of instances where I've pointed out to you guys that they could give you an answer choice that's what would really be the second best way to do something. And that could end up being ultimately what you actually have to choose because there is not another option. So when it comes to modifiers, basically your task is to make sure that nothing is being described in the wrong manner. So you want to make sure you're not describing a book in the way that you were trying to describe the human that's reading the book. So you're essentially making sure the descriptors would be another way to say modifiers, are parked next to the thing they are describing. I'm going to kind of introduce another way of doing this and thinking of this. So I'm essentially going to do this in a completely different way in this class right now than how I did it before, just to give you another perspective on this. If you fairly well understand these and you're doing fairly well on them, continue with what you're doing, unless you think this is even better and it is actually going to help you more. If you're totally confused on modifiers, you might want to combine what I'm saying here with what you had already heard and what you had already worked on. But essentially, the way that we have to do this is we have to think about what are the components of the sentence that we have. So what are the different pieces that we're being forced to bring together? And then what goes with what? So something that can really help besides just reading the sentence and saying, you know, here it says in her inbox from her friend. So you wouldn't want to do that because it's like, what's from her friend? That's in a weird random place. So there's always kind of that element of just reading the choice and determining. There's always two that stand out as like definitely not the right way to do it. So maybe you get rid of those two. And then it's determining, are the modifiers in the right place or not? So that's the way that we approached this the last time. So here, for example, on 8, because this is an easier one to break down, the new minivan was parked by the family behind the house. If you've gotten good at recognizing these, you'll notice that by the family behind the house makes it sound like the family exists behind the house, which in a technical sense, if the family is in the minivan and the minivan is then parked behind the house, in a technical sense, the family is behind the house because they're in that minivan. But the point we're trying to make with the sentence is that the family parked the minivan behind the house, not themselves, right? So by the family behind the house says that the family is what lives behind the house. And I'll be a little bit more dramatic here. Instead of just saying says that the family is behind the house, they're essentially saying that the family lives behind the house. They're describing that as their default place, their default position. Another thing that I notice on this one is the new minivan behind the house. So again, you kind of have to consider, and that's what I'm about to bridge over to with our new strategy. You have to consider what they are trying to say. Because saying the new minivan is behind the house is not necessarily incorrect. I mean, new minivan behind the house, if I just looked at that, I could say, yeah, new minivan behind the house. But the point is being parked, is the fact that the minivan's being parked. So you have to consider everything that's in the sentence. Well, now it makes it sound like the minivan was already behind the house and then got parked. And that's not what they're trying to say. So that's kind of the way that we approached it before. And it just takes some practice to be able to get where you can see those and you can see sort of what the path is to the best way to say something versus the path to the slightly less clear way of saying something. Here's a new suggestion. So again, looking at 8, it can also be very helpful to pull apart the pieces. So look at a couple of your answer choices so that you can kind of determine what are the components of these different sentences that we're trying to put together. And so in this one, what I notice in reading a couple of these examples, because some of them are kind of crappy and some of them are kind of close to what they're trying to say. So I read several of these, and here's what I extract from number 8. These are the 4 big things. There is not a perfect way to list them. So don't worry if you said parked the minivan and I said parked. Don't worry about that. Just look at what are the components of the sentences. So in this sentence, in number 8, I have the family. I have the fact that they parked. I have the new minivan that they parked. And I have the fact that that was behind the house. So if I look at these 4 and I just look at them separately, the family parked the new minivan, parked the new minivan behind the house. If I kind of pull them apart, that can help me determine who goes with who. So we have the family. We're not trying to say the family next to the new minivan, right? That would be pointless. We're not trying to say that the family's behind the house. So we need to make sure that the family and parked are joined together. These need to be together. So when we talk about the family, what are we trying to get at with the family? The fact they parked. And then the new minivan is obviously what got parked. And then where it got parked, so I'll do kind of a crazy little arrows thing, is it got parked behind the house. The arrows is definitely not the point of doing it this way, so don't worry if my arrows are confusing you, or if you don't use arrows, that's totally fine. My point is sometimes instead of just reading each sentence and sort of trying to say, is this better than that, or is that better than this, to say what are the components so that you can maybe see them a little bit more separately, and that would allow you to merge them together a little bit more easily. So in this case, I can see it more clearly when I do this. I'm trying to say the family parked the new minivan behind the house, and that would be choice B, very clearly choice B. You can do it this way, or you can do it in the manner where you're essentially just reading each one and saying, oh, well, this says the family's behind the house instead of the van. This says the van's behind the house instead of saying it got parked behind the house, and so on. Let's do number 9 in the same manner. So when I looked at number 9, and of course, you can totally pause the video if you're kind of understanding what I'm getting at here and you want to try doing your list. Go ahead and pause, make your list of components, and then hit play so you can see my list. If you're not quite there yet, make my list with me here and we'll do another example. So if I look at number 9, I see that we have the car. And this one is almost like they connect to each other completely, to where I almost want to put bullet points. So I have the car, and then the car is what has the body damage. So I can instantly see that those need to go together, the car with the body damage. And then I have that it is on a lift. And then the lift is in a shop. So that gets a little fuzzy because we got a lot of different things going on there. The car with body damage is on a lift, which is in a shop. So again, I could kind of configure this a few different ways, but what I see in this particular question, what I see as being crucial and easy to maybe screw up on, is the lift is in the shop. The lift is already in the shop, with or without the car. The lift is something we would find inside the shop. So we need to make sure that these remain together because there's already a lift in a shop. And what's happening now is that this car is being put on this lift. This car also has body damage. So I need to make sure that when I describe the car, I very quickly describe the body damage also. Because if I don't, then where am I going to put body damage, and it's going to modify the wrong thing. So to give you another angle, What I don't want to happen, I don't want to describe the lift as having body damage. I don't want to describe the, body damage as being what's in the shop. I want to describe the car being what has body damage. I want to describe that same car that has that damage as being what is on the lift. And I want to describe the lift as being something that is in a shop. So again, the car with body damage is on a lift in a shop is going to be A. The car with body damage, so we keep these two together. You can't put body damage anywhere else, or else it won't be clear that we're saying the car has the body damage. So the car with body damage is now on a lift in the shop. So this effectively says the car is on the lift, but the lift is in the shop. So let's look at our other examples and kind of use our old strategy and blend that in here so that we can see where there's misplaced modifiers. The car is now on a lift. That's okay, right? That's not bad. The car is now on a lift. The problem is we didn't say the car had body damage. So now it's awkwardly over here. The car is now on a lift in the shop. In fact, this entire first part is great. The car is now on a lift in the shop, says the car's on the lift, says that lift is in the shop, looking good. The problem is we left this body damage out, and now it's really weirdly tagged on to the end. So what choice B actually says is that the shop is what has body damage. It says shop with body damage. Well, the shop is clearly not what has body damage, so this could only work had we put the body damage up next to the car. Other than that, it's exactly the same. A and B are the same except for body damage being tagged at the end. C, the body damage car. So obviously that's awkward, and most of you probably take that out because it seems awkward, and that's fine. To be more specific than to just say it's awkward, if you want to be a little bit more specific, body damage car would be like naming the car as being in a category called body damage. We're definitely trying to say the car has body damage, not that it's a body damage car. We're not saying it's a Honda. We're saying it is a car that sustained body damage. This part here is fine, is now on a lift in the shop is good. And then this one starts out with body damage. The car is now on a lift in the shop. D is not that bad. Like nothing is completely out of order to where something is describing something entirely wrong. But to start out the sentence with body damage is very awkward. Now, in a situation, because I said earlier that it depends on your choices, in a situation where A, which we've picked because it's definitely the best, doesn't exist, you could end up picking D. D is not great. It's awkward. You might remember from your English 1 class that you have picked out answers before that were, in fact, awkward because there's just not a perfect way to say something. So D is not technically incorrect where something is very obviously misplaced. It's just awkward because they say with body damage, the car, instead of saying the car with body damage. So D is not that bad, but certainly if you have the option to not lead in with a modifier, you definitely want to take that. So I guess my point is whenever possible, and we said this in English 1 because we had some specific instances where we were able to not lead in with a modifier. And then we had a couple of instances where we were forced to lead in with a modifier. So context is everything when it comes to that. So whenever possible, don't lead with a modifier for obvious reasons, right? So a modifier is supposed to be a descriptor that goes with something. Leading with the description is not the ideal way to describe something. It's ideal to give what we're describing, then the description. That is a lot more clear. So whenever possible, don't lead with a modifier. That said, you should always be assessing these sentences for are my modifiers correctly placed to where they're describing the thing I'm trying to describe? Or are they incorrectly placed where I'm describing, you know, the shop as being what has body damage? So there's degrees, right? There's ones that are horribly, terribly wrong and they're so awkward you could cringe. And then there's ones that are not as wrong. They're still not great, but they're not just a complete train wreck like some of the others. In this case, D is not a complete train wreck, but it is awkward, so A is better. B and C have specifically modifiers parked so incorrectly that they are modifying the wrong thing. Let's do, let me see which other ones are good for this. Let's do 10. And 10, we're going to do a list, but it's going to be a little bit different. And that's the thing that you're up against is whatever strategy you decide to use. If you like assessing the choices and finding where something's described wrong, continue with that. If you like doing the list and pulling it apart and then blending it together, continue to do that. You can certainly combine the two, and that's really what's ideal, is to do a bit of both. So maybe you start with listing the pieces, and then you look for ones that have the pieces right, but then you assess all of your choices along the way, whatever makes sense for you. These are all going to kind of look different. They're all going to kind of work different. So the idea is you always need to start out, whether you're using one strategy, the other strategy, or a blend of the two. You've got to start out with reading like the first 2 or 3 answer choices so that you can say, what are they trying to get at? What are the components we're trying to put together here? Because otherwise you're kind of going in blind. To just read a sentence and say, yes, that's great, no, that's terrible, to just compare sentences is not ideal. It's ideal to say, here's a few different ways of saying something. Well, what am I really trying to get across, and how could I organize those myself? So when I went to outline 10, my outline looked quite different than my last couple of outlines. And I'll show you what it looked like. And again, at any point where you're starting to get kind of comfortable with this listing thing, pause the video so that you're not just getting the list from me and you're actually getting some practice with that. So you can always pause before I go to do my list, make your own list and see how we match up. So the way I did my list on 10 is I was like, well, there's 2 people involved. There's me and then there's mother. And that was the first thing that I listed, me, mother. And then I said, so I'm supposed to be 10. My mother is supposed to have enrolled me in dance. So I'm enrolled in dance, but my mother enrolled me in dance. And then I'm supposed to be 10, right? So we're trying to make sure wherever they mention being 10, we want to make sure that it's me that they're saying is 10. And then whenever they mention mother, we want to make sure that we're not saying that mom is 10, and we're not saying that mom does dance. We're saying that mom enrolled me at 10 years old into dance. So when I looked at my choices, the one that I liked was C. And what you'll notice about C is it does kind of lead in with a modifier in a sense when I was 10, but we have to lead with a modifier on this one. There's no way to do this configuration and not have that happen. You had a very similar example in your original English 1 class. So there are situations where there is no clear way to say something unless you lead with a modifier. So saying when I was 10, saying that right away is really good because it makes sure that it's very clear that the 10-year-old is me. And then my mother enrolled me. So that's crucial that it says enrolled me, because it would be very easy to accidentally say that mother enrolled. And then in dance. So when I was 10, my mother enrolled me in dance. So let's look at a couple of the ones that are wrong and see why they're wrong. So like A, for example, says at the age of 10, my mother. If you say at the age of 10, whoever you say next, whatever you follow the at the age of 10 with, that's who's 10. So this says that mom is 10. That's the only problem with it, is just at the age of 10, my mother. So the only place we see mention of me is here, and it's not anywhere near being 10, which makes it look like I'm not the one who's 10. My mother is the one who's 10. Same problem with B, except it's in the opposite order. It says, my mother at the age of 10 enrolled me in dance. So that again says that mom is who is 10, because the noun, the person, place, or thing next to the descriptor is who ends up getting described. We also don't love this structure because we had to use 2 different commas due to the way that they put that sentence together. So this is kind of one of those like an extraneous usage, like an intentional usage of extraneous information, where you're like, my mother, and then you stop to make a side comment, an extraneous comment at the age of 10, and then you go on with your sentence, enrolled me in dance. We don't want that much complication whenever possible. So if it had come down to a couple of good answers and one of them had one of these weird extraneouses tossed in the middle, we would try to avoid that. And then D is wrong for obvious reasons, because it says, I enrolled my mom. So the ones that are obvious can keep paving the way for the ones that are a little bit less obvious. So there's some that are like, I enrolled my mom in dance, where it just jumps out at you and you're like, that's definitely not what they were trying to say. Use those to fuel recognizing smaller and smaller and smaller instances. As you keep getting better and better at this, you'll keep getting to where you can recognize the silliest little things that are wrong versus a big, obvious structural issue. You need to be good at both, but it's a progression. So you want to start with just understanding when a big modifier is misplaced, and then start to move toward understanding when a smaller one is misplaced. There are 3 types of clarity questions, and I want you to be aware of this so that you're almost kind of looking out for it and spotting it along the way. You know that one of the things I emphasize more than any other thing is recognizing a question, labeling that question, and then answering it. There's so much that can be said for reading a question and saying, oh, this is a blank question from my, English 1 class. Recognizing a question, knowing where it came from, knowing what strategy you have that goes with it, that's crucial. You can get more specific. So we know that these are clarity questions because they say, what's the clearest and most correct? We know that right before that, these were punctuation questions. And we know that because we see that it says correct. And then we see that the sentence itself is exactly the same on each one. The thing that's varying is just the punctuation. So recognizing that right away, knowing what you're answering, knowing which class you learned it in, knowing what you learned about it, having all of that working together at the same time will really help you with your accuracy. So something that you can start expanding to now is when you do see clarity, instead of just recognizing that it's clarity or it's not clarity, you can also recognize that there are a few different types of these. So there's just kind of, I guess we're going to say, word organization. So that's what we're working on right now. That's where each of your given sentences is pretty similar to your other given sentences. But you're kind of deciding, do I say this phrase first or do I say this one first? And you're rearranging your wordings to essentially get the clearest. So you'll see these questions asked as what's the clearest or clearest and most correct. And you're just rearranging words. You're rearranging a combination of subjects and modifiers to get it the clearest. Another type is where you put sentence fragments together. We're about to work on that. And so those are on your very next page. And those are the ones where they give you these little pieces of sentences like this. And they say, how do you put them together? So they'll say something like, which of the following best organizes the above sentence fragments to demonstrate clarity? So that's where you actually have to take the pieces. They're already separate. This is where I get the idea that I was just working with these examples of listing out your components, is this actually does list the components. So you will get situations where they list the components and they ask you, how do we put them together? And then the third one is where they point out an actual misplaced modifier. And those are coming up again another page later. That's the ones where they say which of the following parts of the sentence is in the wrong place. And we talked about those in English 1. They're coming up in a couple of pages where they'll give you this and they'll say which of those fragments is actually the misplaced one. So there's ones where you just reorganize whatever's there and come up with the clearest way to put it all together. There's ones where they give you the components and you build them into the clearest sentence that you can. And there's ones that give you a sentence that is screwed up, but instead of just letting you fix it, they make you identify exactly what's wrong with it. So the components one is the one that a lot of you are doing pretty well on. I would say that one is going easier for most of you than the ones we just did. So I'll just do one example. So when we're putting pieces together, we don't have to do that breaking up the pieces because we can see it. But I do recommend thinking about what goes together and maybe numbering it. So like my computer did not turn on this morning goes with I went to the computer store. So I'm going to number these two as 1 because I can tell right away that those are going to need to go together or it's not going to make sense. And then you have the tech was able to determine what was wrong. It was fixed an hour later. And again, those go together. It's obvious that the tech determining the problem and then the computer getting fixed are things that go together. That can help. So that's kind of like listing out the components in the way that we did above, except it's even more crystal clear because you're able to say, oh, I need to get these two things right next to each other and these other two things. One thing to watch out for on putting these together, I'm just going to say it simply. I'm going to say watch for special instructions. Sometimes, and you've seen this before, sometimes they'll say combine them into one sentence. And that makes all the difference in the world because what they'll do if they ask you to make it one sentence is they'll give you one thing that looks and sounds great, but it's not one sentence. And then they'll give you something that's not quite as great, but it is one sentence. And that's what you have to pick because they said one sentence. The other thing they can do, and again, you have seen this before, is they can ask you to use like a conjunction in a particular way. So instead of just saying, put this together in the clearest possible way, they could have a bigger agenda for you. Like, not only do you need to put this together in the clearest possible way, you also need to have a emphasis that is placed on this particular thing. So part of how you organize the pieces together could be how you're trying to actually say something in addition to just being clear. So on this one, now that I have my numbers pointed out, it's really quite simple for me to put the pieces together. So after, let's see, I chose B because it says after my computer wouldn't turn on this morning, I went to the computer store. So you can see that my two that I had labeled as ones are together there. The tech was able to determine what was wrong, and it was fixed an hour later. So this is 2 sentences, and quite honestly, this is not an instance where they could have you do 1 sentence. You can't fit all this into 1 sentence. They did add the word after. That's fine because they didn't say anything about being exact to the fragments or not. So you'll often see that they'll throw in something that kind of gives some transition to bring the pieces together. That's fine unless it says to be exact, which is extremely rare. It's very rare that they do that. So if you look at the other answer choices, what you'll mostly notice is a 1 and a 2 being paired, where it's going back and forth from one part of the subject to the other, and it gets confusing. I went to the computer store and the tech was able to determine what was wrong. Seems good. That is a 1 and a 2 together. The problem is what happens after that. It was fixed an hour later. My computer did not turn on this morning. Leaves out that part that was supposed to go with number 1. So on A, they do have the 2's next to each other, but they have one of the ones stranded away from the other one. C starts out okay. I went to the computer store after my computer wouldn't turn on this morning. That's not as clear as saying after it wouldn't turn on, I went to the store. So there is an element of having it in that order where it's didn't turn on, went to the store. It's clearer to say it in that order than to say went to the store because it wouldn't turn on. That in and of itself does not make an answer wrong. That doesn't make C wrong. The problem is they went kind of a roundabout way with the second part. It was fixed an hour later because the tech was able to determine what was wrong. So on both of the fragments here, on the first part and the second part, they described the 2, or they combined the 2 things that we said should be together in a little bit more complicated of a way than what they could have done. That's where it depends on your answer choices, because you could maybe end up actually picking C if there weren't something better like B. In this instance, B is drop dead clearer than C, so we wouldn't pick C. D very much puts the 1s with the 2's and makes a huge mess out of that. I went to the computer store. It was fixed an hour later. We don't even have something that it is describing yet. My computer had not turned on this morning. The tech was able to determine what was wrong. You can't mention the tech until you mention the store, and they have to be mentioned together. So D is a huge mess. I will leave the rest of those combining ones for you guys. I will point out here, this one wants you to use a conjunction to combine them, and it wants a particular result from that, which is for the focus to be on the reason for going to the store. These exercises are wonderful because they really help you think about conjunctions. They really help you think about using a conjunction for a very specific purpose. And they allow you to practice structuring conjunctions to where you can see how they're being used. That's really good because if you have actually yourself taken conjunctions and placed them to achieve a certain result, it's going to be easier for you to detect when someone else does that. When you're reading a sentence that someone else did that with, it's going to be more obvious what kind of point they're trying to make. I'm going to go ahead a couple pages to this misplaced modifier. I talked about this in English 1, and I do want to point out this is very much a test-specific kind of thing. So there is sort of a trick of the trade with this, and that is that it is almost always, I'm always going to say almost just to be extremely safe, the last modifier. I will re-explain in the same manner that I did during English 1 why that is. When they talk about which modifier is misplaced, it's kind of like, almost like the question of, you know, which came first, the chicken or the egg? How do you specify that this is the modifier that's wrong, and how do you know that it's not this other modifier that's wrong? Well, there's not a perfectly clear answer to that question. There's not a black and white, like, well, this modifier is great and this one's wrong in these particular instances. I would read these sentences and I would say, up to a point, the sentence is perfect. And when we reach the point where the sentence isn't perfect anymore, it is really arguable whether you should move the first fragment or the second one. When they come up with what the answers are, they choose the one that comes last in the sentence. The reason that they do that is because there's kind of this weird little technicality, and hopefully you remember us discussing this already, where if you go to replace a modifier that is misplaced, there's kind of two ways that that could happen, and it could involve 2 to 3 movements of different things versus 1 movement. So what they're targeting with their chosen answer is they're taking the modifier that could be moved without any other thing getting moved and then fixing the sentence that way. So if you have to move something, you know, somewhere and then move something else, and that's what fixes it, you had to take multiple steps to do that. So that would not be the correct modifier to move. If you only have to do 1 movement, 1 thing, then that could arguably be the best way to fix a misplaced modifier. So the way that they do these is they'll list out 4 different parts of the sentence. Usually 2 of them are from the part of the sentence that's great, and it'll be kind of obvious that they are not in the wrong place. And then the other 2 are usually from the second part of the sentence where it's starting to fall apart. So if we read this first example, the charge nurse told me to place the tourniquet on the upper arm instead of the lower arm where it belongs. The charge nurse is most definitely not misplaced. That is supposed to be the subject right at the beginning of the sentence. So we can get that out of there. Told me is also in its correct place. You could not put that anywhere else. So the charge nurse told me is great. We have not run into an issue yet. The other 2 answers that they gave us are in the part of the sentence where we are beginning to run into issues. So she told me to place the tourniquet, so it's great up to this point, on the upper arm. So we want to place the tourniquet on the upper arm instead of the lower arm. So this is all great. That is clear. If I say the charge nurse told me to place the tourniquet on the upper arm instead of the lower arm, you would see exactly what I was getting at. Then we have this where it belongs, and the where it belongs is next to lower arm, when what we're trying to say is that where it belongs is on the upper arm. So for the sake of argument, there are 2 ways that you could fix that. You could move upper arm so that upper arm came over here to join where it belongs, but you'd have to move a few other things in order to actually make that work. The better solution is to take where it belongs, last fragment. I don't like you guys to memorize things, but there are certain little tiny corners where it kind of does make sense, and this is one of them. It's always going to end up being the last modifier, because the last modifier can be moved up into the sentence, forced into the sentence, and it doesn't leave a gap when you move it. If I moved on the upper arm out, I would leave a giant gap right there. And then I'd have to do something to change that, to fill that gap, like moving this up and then moving that up. So that's where, in a technical sense, there's multiple movements involved if you move one thing, and then there's not multiple movements if you move another thing. So if I move where it belongs up here, I can fix the entire sentence in one movement. that's going to make that my misplaced modifier. I won't do the other example so that you can use that as practice. Eventually, I will come out with more practices of those. They are not easy to write in accordance with how you see them on the test. So what I encourage is, rather than practicing a whole bunch of that, is to look at the 4 examples that you now have across your intense review in your original lectures, and just make sure that you have a good sort of solution in place that you're using to make sure you consistently do those in the same manner. So practice is not overly effective there because you're just going to keep doing the same thing. What's important is knowing why you're doing that thing and making sure that that's what you're doing. I'm going to do parts of speech in a very quick, easy way. This probably made a lot of sense to most of you as you went through class, and I really don't get asked about this much. Essentially, what you need to know for parts of speech is, what are the 4 core parts of speech? So noun, verb, and then adjective, which is a descriptor that describes a noun, and adverb, which is a descriptor that describes a verb. So know your 4 core parts of speech and be able to identify them. More importantly, you need to know how sentence structure impacts parts of speech. Just like we've said all night, we have situations where there are conjunctions and situations where there aren't. And the presence of a conjunction changes a lot about the sentence. It changes whether or not there's commas involved. It changes where the emphasis of the sentence is, where the point is actually made versus where it's not. It changes whether you would call it compound or whether you would call it complex, and I could go on all day. It also impacts parts of speech. Specifically, it impacts the location of the subject. If you have a conjunction in a sentence, that will potentially impact where the subject is. Where the subject is impacts where the verb is that goes with that subject. You could have 5 verbs in a sentence. There's nothing that says you couldn't. You could also have 5 nouns in a sentence. However, you can only have 1 subject, and then there's only 1 verb that is describing what that 1 subject is actually doing. That's important because that is most often what you're going to get asked. So typically what you're going to be asked is, what's the subject of this sentence? But they throw a curveball and they have the subject be in a different part of the sentence than where we might normally see it because of the presence of a conjunction. So let's look at how this would look in a couple of examples. This is my big key thing for you. I'm not going to talk about adverbs and adjectives. I'm just going to talk about the conjunctional element. We talked about this in English 1, so this was the examples that we used. And what I essentially said is, if you start a sentence with a conjunction, with a subordinate conjunction at the start of a sentence, that is going to mean one very specific thing, which is the subject can't be in that first clause. So again, think about conjunctions and what they do. A conjunction causes a dependent clause. So the presence of the conjunction equals the presence of a dependent clause. A dependent clause is not the point of the sentence. Whenever we have a dependent clause, it's a sidestep from our main point. While I was headed to work, we know because of the word while that the point isn't being headed to work. The point is something else that happened alongside being headed to work. So the dependent clause is not the point, is another way of saying it can't contain the subject. Another way of saying what I just said is the subject of a sentence must be found in the independent clause. You cannot have the whole subject of your entire sentence be in the dependent clause. That is impossible. So whenever we use a conjunction, it does something very specific to our sentence. It shifts the focus of our sentence. So it also shifts the placement of what we call the subject. So a conjunction shifts focus, and in turn, shifting focus shifts the subject's placement. These were the examples we used before. Remember that the subject could actually be something that doesn't even look like a subject too. So the example I gave you in class is a very real example that's been spotted on the test many times, which is when I was in high school. So you know because of the word when that that's conjunction and that that's a transitional phrase. So you know that it's not going to contain the subject. But then you get to the second part of the sentence, and the first word in the second part of the sentence is the word running. Normally we would think of running as a verb, but in this case, it's being talked about as a sport, running as a sport as opposed to the act of running. Running as a sport certainly fits into the person, place, or thing category. And a person, place, or a thing would be a noun, and a noun can be a subject. And so the subject of this sentence is running, because they're talking about it as an activity. You will always notice that the subject immediately follows that dependent clause as well. Here's a couple of examples that I wrote for you to practice. We're only going to do the first one, leaving you all the rest of it for your own practice. After trying multiple textbooks, Jenny decided to go another route on studying for the exam. Which of the following is the subject? So after trying multiple textbooks, in this case, is the dependent clause. So we know that we cannot have our subject there. Immediately following the dependent clause, right after the comma, is always going to be our subject. And we also want to make sure, we want to kind of double back and double check ourselves that the sentence is actually about whatever we say the subject is. So based on its placement, Jenny would be the subject. Reading the entire sentence and determining or double checking that Jenny is in fact what the sentence is about. After trying multiple textbooks, Jenny decided to go another route. So yes, the sentence is about Jenny, and that makes her the subject based on her placement and based on the sentence being focused on her. So we use our conjunction phrase rule to take that out, and then we determine that Jenny would be the subject. The second part of this question is, which of the following is the verb that describes what the subject is doing? There's more than one verb here. The verb that's describing what Jenny is doing, again, can't be in the dependent clause. To describe what Jenny's doing has to happen in the independent clause. And it would be easier to fall for that on this one than it was on the previous question. So you know that your subject is found in the independent clause. So is the verb that goes with it. So trying, although it is a verb and it is describing Jenny, that is not the verb that goes with Jenny. The verb that goes with Jenny is decided. After trying multiple textbooks is completely out because it's a dependent clause. Jenny decided is our subject and verb. So there's more of those to practice. They all have two parts to them. Very, very, very quick review of points of view. You have first, second, and third person points of view. First person is I, me, my. So the person is talking about themselves. Second person is you or your. and it's also talking to the reader. This is my main point here. Most of points of view, I think you guys are great on. The only concern I have is identifying a weird instance of second person. And then third person, the narrator is not involved. They're saying he, they, she, the group, something that they're completely removed from. Don't forget about pronoun antecedent agreement as well, which is an agreement in point of view from one part of the sentence to the other. So for example, if you start out talking about a guy, you continue talking about a guy rather than saying John and then saying she to describe John. And then also if you start out in first person, you stay in first person and you don't go off into third person later in the sentence. The example that I want to show you is just the very first one here. Which of the following demonstrates second person voice? And this is going to be A, because it's talking to you. So remember that second person is not only if it actually says you and is talking to you and addressing you, it's also if it's just talking at you. So to you or at you. They could actually be saying you, or they could never say you, but they also never say I or they or she or anything else, and it's aimed at you as you read it. There are more practices for voice so that you can make sure you're good there. This is the updated spelling and word meanings list. I included it here because it is an integral part of your whole English process. We're not going to talk about it. That's just to make sure you remember that that is there and that you're supposed to study that. Those are the words as far as spelling or word meaning that you could really expect to see. So rather than trying to chase down random vocabulary, just be familiar with those, but be extremely familiar with them because there are different answers that are correct for them in different contexts. So there's more than one thing that could be right about each of them. This next section is formal and informal language. So what we talked about before with formal and informal, I would encourage you to make sure you've really taken to heart everything that I said right here, because there's a lot more to it than what stands out to most of you. What should stand out is the contraction words, because that's what I emphasized in the lecture. For the most part, when you go to pick out a formal or informal language answer choice, that's going to be what the issue is. Some of them have contraction words and some of them don't. Having a contraction, I don't care how wonderful the sentence sounds, it makes it informal if there is a word that is used as contraction. It's also informal to have short, partial, or incomplete sentences like I want to go or I like that. Slangs or nicknames, anything that is a relative term or a comparative term, anything that's like a pop culture phrase, anything that is not what you would find in a book for learning the English language. So anything that is outside of a completely neutral, formal tone that absolutely everyone can understand would cause something to be informal. These first few examples are very similar to what I gave you before. So these are the easier ones. And then the next page has a couple that are a bit harder. So like the first question here, go ahead and pause and do the first two questions so that you can practice here. And then we'll go on to slightly more difficult ones. So number one, if you haven't paused, go ahead and pause. Number one is going to be D. So the problem with C was the I've. The problem with A and B, both of those are really short, so they're not descriptive sentences. They're shortened. And then the other problem is if only would be very informal. So to say if only or to say I wish, both of those are very informal. And so what I've started to notice as I keep thinking about what else can I bring you to make sure you're truly in the best possible position with identifying these language types. what I keep noticing in my expansions is there's just certain words that because of the way they get used, so it's not like you could make a list and say, oh, this word is informal and that word is informal. But because of the way that they appear, because of the way they wind up being used, they ultimately do typically represent informal. So some examples of that is like fun, I wish, or if only. You'll notice the word some as we're moving forward into our next batch of examples. The word some can often have an informal kind of effect to it. And there's lots of others, so you can't memorize these. Again, there's not a way to just know this. The things that you can memorize are these. Those will get you through 99% of the formal versus informal language questions. Number 2 here, before I move to the harder ones, number 2 is going to be C. 2 of these are very, very obvious. A has I'm and B has I've. Unfortunately, whether they're wonderfully formal other than that or not, it's not formal to use a contraction. You would not use contractions on your resume or in an email to a prospective employer. The difference between C and D is how concise the language is. So I attended the university for 4 years and then began my career is much more formal than having attended university, I began a career. So this I began a career, when you compare it right up against and then began my career, and then the I attended the university for 4 years up against having attended university, it would be more formal to use the language in C. So sometimes, and again, do not memorize this, it won't do a darn thing for you, but sometimes, like we see in this instance, the length of a sentence can have something to do with how we select formal and informal. And not necessarily just the length of a sentence, because that's definitely not an academically accurate statement, but more so how briefly certain things get said, and they could be said too briefly to where it's a little bit unclear, or it sounds like a short fragment, which we always take those out as well. And so again, remember, depends on the choices that you have. Really depends on what your choices are. Number 4 is a great example of that. I do want you to try number 4. I want you to put a little time into number 4. I'm taking you into this totally blind. I went into this totally blind. So I want you to kind of use your instinct on how these are assembled. They're obviously very long patches of sentences. And actually, there's a slight error here in the fact that I said, what's an example of a formal sentence? None of these are one single sentence. They're all multiple. So what you're looking for is, if somebody said each of these things, which person would you say is using the most formal language versus who might be using less formal? So go ahead and pause, look through 4, take a couple answers out right off the bat that you can tell are not formal, whether you can pinpoint the reason why or not. And then when you get down to the slightly more specific ones, see how you can dig deep and think about comparing your different options. So go ahead and pause now to do that. I am now going to start giving the answer. So if you haven't paused, pause quickly. What I picked for this is A. And I'm essentially going to point out to you, and you'll see it on the key as well. I underlined on the key any word that related to me taking out a choice because it was not as formal is underlined on the key. And it'll look exactly the same on my screen here, but if you don't capture all of this right at this moment, the key will also showcase why. So like on B, our priority is to work together to improve the quality of our programs is great. That is no better and no worse than how A started out. So both of those are good there. What I noticed with B is they start out here with the word optimally, and then they go to the word secondly, and those don't go together, and then they go to the word then. So one of the things I noticed here, and again, it's not something I would tell you to memorize at all. It's just something I would say you'll discover when you're digging deep to try to figure out how these choices are comparing to each other and how to get the most formal. Hopefully you'll notice, well, I mean, you think of formal language, think of something important. Anytime you think of formal language, think of like, how would I type an email to someone who just interviewed me for my dream job type of thing. So would you say optimally, secondly, then? Probably not. You'd probably say first, second, third, or, you know, optimally and then less optimally. You would want your introductory conjunctions to match. So that was one major problem that I discovered in B. And then the other thing I discovered here is when they said then we should implement some solutions. Some was one of the words I mentioned up here that I've just noticed is often involved in informal language. The word some is not a disqualifying word. So you can't do the same thing you do with contractions with the word some. You can't say, oh, informal, because it's got the word some. It's not quite that cut and dry. However, in some instances, if you're aware of the word some and you're aware of some of these other words that tend toward informal, that might help. So I feel like the word some, at least in the way that they choose to use it in a lot of these instances, leans to the informal side. There's a better, more formal way for this last sentence to sound, because implement some solutions, for whatever reason, implement solutions would sound formal. Some solutions sounds suddenly like you're talking to your friend rather than emailing a prospective employer. So those were the two things I said I didn't like about B, is the conjunctions don't match, and the word some right there at the end came across informal. And if you're getting some of what I'm getting, but you're not noticing exactly why and you didn't pinpoint that, that's okay. Because becoming aware of this through some practice and through this intense review will just help you kind of have more awareness of these different things that might be happening. It's totally okay if you're like, that doesn't sound as good as that. That doesn't sound as formal as that. That's totally good. It's just beneficial if you can then go back and say, oh, I see why I didn't like this, because some solutions sounds like I'm talking to my mom, versus, you know, finding solutions sounds more like I'm talking to someone professionally. On C, the we got is really bad. And you probably took C out just instinctively. You probably just thought, well, it just doesn't look formal. We got is very informal. In fact, you could put that as part of this little list here. Like, that's like saying had fun. You would not say had fun to someone in a professional environment, and you would not say we got to someone in a professional environment. That's the only thing I really pointed out on C, except I also thought it was kind of awkward here where it says we need to say what we're thinking. I thought that was also kind of awkward. So say what we're thinking is like an informal version, and actually this is a good showcase example. And they didn't use a contraction. They did say we are, so it wasn't instantly recognizable as informal. So there's say what we are thinking, and then a formal version of that, in my opinion, an example that's off the top of my head is something like share our thoughts, or maybe discuss our thoughts. So say what we are thinking, say what we are thinking. Everything about that has an informal tone to it. Share our thoughts, discuss our thoughts, collaborate over our thoughts, something more like that, using thoughts instead of thinking, using share or discuss instead of using say what, would come across more formal. These are not rock solid rules. These are things that I observed when I was essentially going through and asking myself, why do I not think this answer choice is formal? Why do I think that this answer choice is formal? So just getting this type of practice now can give you more tools. Just don't memorize them, because there is no cut and dry with a lot of this. If it is cut and dry, it's already listed up here. You've already got it down. If it's anything new that I'm discussing, you can't count on it and bank on it. You just need to be aware that if you feel like initially reading one choice seems a bit more formal than another, maybe you can pinpoint, oh, I see it's the we got, or oh, I see it's because of the way they use the word some that I'm thinking what I'm thinking. So you can validate your instinct using some of this. D, the conjunctions again did not match. So you had first and then for example. And then the other thing I didn't like is for us to talk about problems. So again, this is a good showcase. To talk about problems sounds like how you would talk to someone that you know pretty well. Discuss problems, or even better, discuss issues, would sound much more formal. The word issue or concern is better than the word problem from a formal standpoint, but you could most certainly have problem in a formal sentence. So again, you can't bank on that. But certainly if you compare side by side, discuss concerns or discuss issues or even discuss problems is better than talk about. Talk about comes across very informal. Hopefully that helps with a little bit of those bigger contexts. Again, don't forget your basics. Stick very much to what we already said and what we already did about that, because that's really the key. And then really it's just a matter of kind of adding these bigger thought processes just for instances that are a bit harder. Also remember to consider who is talking to who or what environment we're in, because sometimes when they ask about formal versus informal, it's more of a question of like, how would an employer speak to an employee? How would a instructor speak to their students? So there's also situational context that may be part of that decision. Quote rules. I'm going to really quickly review these. There are two major things you're supposed to know off the top of your head to be able to identify them on the test. One of them is bridged quotes, and another is quotes involving questions. So those are kind of the two big things we discussed in class. Bridged quote is where they begin with somebody's sentence, and then they put who is talking, and then they continue what they were saying. I could speak in two separate sentences, or I could speak in one sentence. And if you interrupt what I said, so if you're quoting me and you interrupt to say that it's me talking, the two possible instances are you could be interrupting literally in the middle of a sentence, or you could be interrupting between two sentences. Either way, when you see a bridged quote, it is two things that very much go right there together as part of the same moment of speech for whoever you're quoting. The difference that you need to be looking out for when you see that there's an attribution parked in the middle like this, remember that attribution is when they attribute the quote to whoever is speaking. When you see that that's parked in the middle, you can see, by the way, I've got them underlined, how obvious it is that that's what we're dealing with there. That doesn't look anything like this does down here. What you need to determine is it two sentences or one? If it's one sentence, for the most part, we're going to do all the things we would normally do in a sentence. If it is two sentences, we're going to do the things we normally do when we have two sentences. What I'm thinking of is like capitalization. So capitals, commas versus periods. A lot of this really actually doesn't have too much to do with the quote. It has a little bit more to do with just how do we normally put these things together. So like in this one up here, you have, I didn't see an actual alien being, but I sure wish I had. The first step is you ignore the attribution, you read everything that's being said, and you make this determination here. Is it one sentence or two? So on this first example, that's definitely one continuing sentence. You know for a fact that it is because of the word but. So you can't have but start a sentence, so you know that's a continuation of the same sentence, where here you can see that that is two separate sentences. If it's two separate sentences, you still have to connect the attribution to one of them or the other, because Mary said is not a sentence in and of itself, but it doesn't matter which. So one of your two quoted sentences will just end with a period. The other will be joined by a comma to the attribution. If it is one sentence, you need to make absolute certain right away that there are two commas, no periods in the middle. You need to make sure right away that there is no capitalization of the second part of the sentence. That is not a new sentence starting. It is just a new part. And then, of course, you always want to make sure your quotes are parked correctly. You want to make sure your commas are inside your quotes if they're coming at the end, and they're before your quote if they're coming at the beginning. Your period will always need to be inside your quote. So the little things, the little silly details are also important. With question marks, remember that there are two major ways a question mark quote happens. One of them is the quote is a question. So if you quote someone who is asking a question in their quote, then the question mark is going to go inside their quote. And if it's the whole statement is a question, but the quote isn't, then the question mark will go outside of the quote. So the two examples that we have for that, inside the quotation marks would be when the quote itself is the question. I'm going to point out the second example so that I can point out something else. She asked, "May I come along?" So you see that you have a capital M here. That's crucial. So this one is wrong. I have this one placed here as a wrong example. Make sure that you label that because for some reason I didn't. So what's wrong with that third one is the fact that they didn't capitalize the first part of someone's sentence that was speaking. So when you start up a quote, you have to capitalize it because it's the beginning of that person's sentence that they just started. And then we need a comma in between the attribution and the quote, like always. In this case, the quoted language is what the question is. So we want the question mark inside the quote with the question. In the case like you see here, this, the quote, is actually a statement, in which case we wouldn't want to put the question mark with the statement. We would want it to be outside the quote because it's actually going with this. So in this case, did he say, "I can't give you a bite of my sandwich because I ate it all"? Again, comma there. So between the attribution or the question in this case and the quote. This right here would always be capitalized even if it weren't I, because that's the beginning of the spoken sentence. And then here we want the question mark outside the quote, because if it's inside the quote, it goes with what was quoted. And in this case, that would not make sense because he didn't ask, he said something. I did include practice for you to continue practicing on quotes. Possessions, again, apostrophes, I'm going to do a very, very brief thing because I want to make sure we get to sentence structures and that we end this relatively quick. So remember with punctuation for possession that there's essentially a couple of things that you need to think about. The first thing you want to think about is the word singular or plural? So whatever you're putting possession with, is it singular or is it plural? If a word is singular, you're going to have an apostrophe and you're going to have an added S. So if something is singular, you're going to put an S on it. That S is going to come after the apostrophe that you add to it. If something is plural, you're going to put an apostrophe after its S. That leaves one big glowing question. What if something's plural, but it doesn't end in an S? So when we think of S at the end of a word, we think of that making a word plural. Most words that are plural do end in S. There are, however, quite a few words that are plural that do not end in an S. What you might remember, hopefully you remember from English 1, is that that is going to fall into the singular category. So a plural that doesn't end in S, for example, women or men or children, we will do exactly the same thing we do with singulars. If it is both plural and ends in an S, that's the only instance where we do something different. And that something different is we leave the word alone. We just toss an S at the or an apostrophe, I'm sorry. We toss an apostrophe at the very end after the S that was already in place. So we have 3 word categories. You have singular words. Doesn't matter with a singular word whether it ends in an S or not. You're always going to add 2 things, an apostrophe and an S, whether it ends in an S or not if it's singular. Then you have plural not ending in S. And again, those 2, so I'm going to put a bracket to join them together. Those function exactly the same. So a singular word with or without an S at the end, and a plural word without an S at the end, we're going to have apostrophe and then S. A plural ending in S, we're going to add an apostrophe after that S. Those are the 3 possibilities. I'll go through a couple of examples very fast. Pause the video, do number 1, number 2, and number 4. And I want to point something out on number 4 real quick before you go to do that. On C, add another S after the apostrophe. That's what that one is supposed to be. So the answer choice on C for number 4 is wrong. Once you have done that, go ahead and pause and do numbers 1, 2, and 4. I will give the answers and explanations to those in just a second. So I am back. If you have not paused, made the correction, and then paused to do the work, go ahead and do that. On number 1, Boss's Day, the word boss is a singular word, even though it ends with 2 S's. So a singular word, we put an apostrophe and an S, and that is C. Number 2, it was the 5 bosses' decision to join the teams together. Bosses, when it's plural, does end in S. It actually ends in an ES. So we just tag an apostrophe on without disturbing the word. Number 4, now that you have C modified, the correct answer to number 4 would be A. The reason I had you modify choice C is actually either of those could have been correct because you don't know whether we're talking about multiple girls or one girl. All you know is it's the girls walk home. So if it's one girl who has a long walk home, we do this. If it's 2 or 3 girls that have a long walk home, we do that. There is no way to prove that one of those is better than the other because we don't know if we're talking about one or multiple. But with the corrected answer choice on C, all the other options do not work. They'll only give you one of the 2 correct possibilities if there is actually more than one. We've talked a fair amount about it, so I'm going to do this part very quickly. Simple, compound, and complex sentences. You need to be very, very good at this. And so it's very important that you have your strategy down here. The strategy is what to focus on. We have certainly been expanding our understanding of this concept, and we have certainly been putting this concept together with some of the other concepts that we're also required to know, and that helps a bunch. But ultimately, this right here is what we need to focus on and stick to. Remember what each definition is. I'll say them quickly because I said them earlier. A simple sentence is one independent clause. That's it. A compound sentence is two simple sentences. They could be joined with a coordinate conjunction that's added, or they could be joined with a semicolon. Two independent sentences. A complex has one independent and it has one dependent, and it stands out like a sore thumb because it has a subordinate conjunction. So these two up here can both have coordinate conjunctions potentially. They can also both not have any conjunction. So a simple or a compound could have one of two things, both of them interchangeably, could have coordinate, could have no conjunction. In the case of a compound, where we join two sentences, the only way to not have a conjunction is if there's a semicolon. In the case of a simple, you could have a conjunction or not because you just have one independent clause. Your steps as a reminder. So first you eliminate fragments. If something is not a complete sentence, it is out of the running. Then you identify subordinate conjunctions. So we always look for subordinate right after we get rid of fragments, because we know that if something has a subordinate conjunction, it is complex. Then we look for coordinate conjunctions, because that could identify a compound or a simple sentence. There's one big difference. So if you do identify that you have two or maybe even three sentences that have coordinate conjunctions, the ones that are compound will have a subject that immediately follows the conjunction. So a compound would have but I, or and they, so we. So the we, the they, the I, that is a subject that immediately follows the coordinate conjunction. If there isn't another subject after a coordinate is used, then we have a simple. Simple has no extra subject. I'm going to integrate punctuation this time. If you are doing absolutely fabulous with your identifying sentence structures, if you're having zero problems whatsoever with this, then you don't need to start thinking about punctuation. If you're having just a little bit of trouble with like the compound versus the simple as you're getting down to the end or something like that, then this might be helpful. So let's look at a couple of examples because we know what our steps are. Let's look at the first one. So I have a couple of examples pointed out that I want to do. I do want you to use your process, so go ahead and pause, and I want you to do number 1 and 2, number 5, and then number 13 and 14, which is a few pages up. So go ahead and pause to do, I'll list that again, number 1 and 2, number 5, number 13, and number 14. Go ahead and pause and put your process and strategy into place. Those are ones I pointed out for whatever reason that have something I can elaborate on. I'm going to start them right now, so go ahead and pause if you have not done them yet. So the first one wants a compound sentence. Always follow the steps in the same order. Do not change the order of events because you're looking for one thing or another. That's going to mean we always identify fragments first. then complex sentences, then we usually find our compound and or our simple. There's not necessarily an order on the compound simple, but you need to have taken out fragments first, and you need to have taken out complex before you start doing this. So don't go in looking for the components that a compound sentence has. Go in looking for fragments. This whole set, I did very few, if any, fragments because they're easy. So I kept it where you're truly identifying sentence structures from 4 viable sentences on every one of them. So you won't see much in the way of fragments. Keep doing that step though, because on the real test, you could very well have a fragment and you could very well miss it if you're not practicing it. Then we want to identify complex. So in this case, I found that D was complex. So after would definitely be a subordinate conjunction the way it's used there. That would be complex. I don't see any other subordinate conjunctions. So that leaves me with A, B, and C, and I'm now down to compound and simple. The key difference between a compound and a simple is that when there are coordinate conjunctions involved, a compound would have a subject that follows it, and a simple wouldn't. What you'll notice on this one is we have 2 simples and a compound left. The one that's a compound is the one that has a subject following its coordinate. But they would give us a compound. Now on choice B, there's an and, but there is no subject. It's and found it rather than and it or and they or whatever. So B does have a coordinate conjunction, doesn't have a subject following it. That's one way that we get a simple. And then A does not have a conjunction at all. It is not a fragment, it is a sentence. So when a sentence does not have conjunctions to it at all, then it is simple. So A and B were simple, C was compound, and D was complex. On number 2, they want us to find simple. Again, going to go back to my steps the way that I know to follow them. I look for fragments first. There are no fragments. B is a short sentence, but it is a complete sentence. So we don't have any fragments. Complex is going to have subordinate conjunctions, and I have 2 of them in this instance. I have A with the word before, so we can take that out of the running. And I have D with the word after, so we can take that out of the running. So there's our complex. Now we're down to compound and simple. Of what's left, I will go to the store this afternoon, does not have a conjunction at all, so that would make it simple. C, to verify that that is in fact the right answer, says but I. So that is a coordinate conjunction followed by a subject. A coordinate conjunction followed by a subject is compound. Going to 5. So the other possible kind of structure for these questions is they can give you part of a sentence and have you fill in the rest of it, which can make it just a little harder because you can't see the whole thing together, but it is exactly the same way that we do it. So you don't even really, once you read the sentence once, the woman who lives across the street is, you really don't need to do anything with that. You can find everything you need to find in your answer choices, just like you do when your answers are complete sentences. So they want us to find a simple completion for this. So when I look through here, I do the same thing. Fragments are tricky in this instance. Typically, they won't put a fragment when they have the sentence split up already because it's really confusing. But there are no fragments, and we know that because we know that we have this part and then this part, and that when you combine them together, each of these is a sentence. Complex, you can see we don't have any, actually. There are no complex on this one. We have no instance where we see a subordinate conjunction. So that would move us to our last step, which is compound versus simple. So identify any coordinate conjunctions that you can find. And again, just 2 of them have coordinates. And both of the ones that do have coordinates also have the word we right after, which is a subject. So a coordinate followed by a subject is a compound. Something I do want to point out that I actually meant to point out slightly earlier, but that's okay. Notice that when it's compound, it will have a comma. When it's simple, it won't. So the difference between a compound and a simple, and there's one place that I'm going to point out very specifically that you can see it, is a subject word or not. And if there's a subject word, there's also going to be a comma right before the conjunction because they added the conjunction in specifically to separate the sentences, where a simple won't. So a simple could have commas, so you have to be very careful. It would not have a comma before its coordinate. And I always said don't do anything with punctuation in my original classes. I still sort of stand by that. I want you to have as much visibility as possible, but I do want you to be very careful about the fact that punctuation is not the best way to do this or identify this. However, you can see when I glance at number 5, I have a heads up that C and D are probably compound because I can see the comma. The comma is there because of the subject being there. If you see, but in the middle of the sentence in that position and there's not a comma before it, that's a heads up that it might be simple. So one extra thing to think about, the way that they use a coordinate conjunction in the middle of a simple does not have a comma. So that leaves us with A and B. B has a semicolon. A semicolon is a dead giveaway that it is compound. So it's 2 sentences and they didn't even put a conjunction between them. It's literally 2 sentences. So that would be out. And that would leave A, which is rarely seen outside of her home. No conjunctions is a simple. Moving to, let's see. Number 13 is a really good showcase of what I just said about the commas, and it's also a good showcase of simple versus compound. This is looking for simple. There are no fragments, but you always start with fragments. As far as complex, there are 2 that are complex, A and B. So A is complex because it has the word after. B is complex because it starts with the word despite. That leaves C and D. C and D are unbelievably similar answer choices. Unbelievably similar. They almost look the same. The differences between them, the comma. So that's where you can see the comma. The way that they put she in here, that's your other difference. So what you're supposed to be looking for from your original strategy is a subject to follow a coordinate conjunction. So but she would make it compound. That has a comma because it has the initial subject. Here you'll notice there's no comma because there is also no subject. So D is a simple sentence. C versus D, this particular example is an excellent exercise for understanding that minute difference between a simple and a compound when the simple does have a conjunction. They're extremely similar. The compound will have a subject following its conjunction and will therefore have a comma. 14 is looking for compound, which is not going to alter the way that we're going to do this. So the first thing I need to look for is fragments, and there are none. The second thing I need to look for is subordinate conjunctions to identify my complex sentences. And we have 2 of those. So C and D, after and because, are complex. That leaves A and B, which actually, again, just like our last example, is a great way for you to see the minute difference between a simple and a compound if they're organized the same. So A is simple because it says and then went, and you notice there's no comma there. B is compound because it's got the comma and says they. So it's when they structure a simple close to the structure of a compound, it's fairly obvious because of the comma and because of the subject. So A is going to be, oops, we're answering compound. So B is going to be the compound. A is the simple. I almost answered A thinking we were trying to find a simple, but we are trying to find a compound. Be very careful with that in the questions, because I've actually had a lot of instances on my real test where I think I'm answering a simple and I'm answering a compound, or I think I'm answering a complex and I'm answering a compound. And there's been a lot of instances where I've just gotten this weird feeling that I might have done something wrong. And I go back to look and I'm like, oh, sure enough, I thought that said compound and it says complex. So just be careful. The last section is subject-verb agreement. I'm not going to go into a lecture on this because you either took English 3 or you didn't. English 3 is completely about all the different rules of how subjects and verbs agree. Tons of information, tons to understand and have memorized. And you're either doing that as part of your program or you're not. These examples that I put in here are relatively simple, so that you can just get some basic practice. A lot of the time, if you do get a couple subject-verb questions, they'll be kind of simple. And the reason that I don't emphasize English 3 is the subject-verb is a maximum of 3 questions. So it can't be worth very many points. However, if you're trying to score pretty high, you need every point that you can get, because you will make mistakes that are completely not reflective of your skill level. So that said, if you didn't do anything with subject-verb agreement, most of these should be intuitive. And I definitely encourage you to read through the pamphlet that's ahead of this about the different ways that the subjects and verbs are evaluated and put together. And then most of these should be fairly intuitive, and most of these would be reflective of what at least 1 or 2 of these would actually look like. So go ahead and pause to do the very first segment. That's the one I'm going to go through with you. Everything else you will use as your practice. So go ahead and pause if you haven't. I'm about to give the answers. So Sally is singular. So Sally runs to the park. We have an S in one place or the other, or we have a plural indication in one place or the other. The dogs, so that's plural. So the dogs bark. Ted and Mary. So when we have 2 subjects and there's an and between them, it makes it plural. It basically makes it they. So Ted and Mary is like saying they. So they are going to the movies. The game was exciting because game is singular. They worry too much. So there's no S involved in number 5, but they is plural. So worry sounds like it's singular. She studies every night. So she is singular. We make the verb look somewhat like it's plural. That's not a black and white real thing. That's just kind of a way that you can think of it. And it's mentioned in English 3. Black or white. So when we have an or, we take the subject, because there's 2 subjects joined by an or. We take the subject that is closer to the verb and we disregard the other one. So that means that we're just going to use the word white and not even use the black or the or. So white is your choice. Even though there's 2 subjects listed, we only use one of them to modify the verb because it has or. That was incredible because that is singular. Those is plural. So those are pretty shoes. the cat or dog. So again, we have or. Or is going to cause us to pick just the subject close to the verb, which in this case is dog. So dog is in the yard. One thing I will point out before it gets more complicated in English 3, the first few things that we talk about is 2 subjects. So it's pretty easy when you just have one subject, Sally, the dog, the game, they, that's usually fairly easy. When you have 2 subjects, they could be joined one of 3 possible ways. They could be joined by an and. That will combine them into a plural. So if you have this person and that person, it becomes they. You could have an or between them, and you'll use only the subject closer to the verb, and you'll ignore the other one. So whichever of the 2 subjects that are separated by the or, whichever one of those is closer to the verb, you will disregard the other one like it was never there, and you will just use that one. And then you have as well as. With as well as, we ignore the as well as part. And what we use is the subject that was before that. So it'll be like Jenny as well as. We just pretend there is no as well as, and we just default back to the original name or original subject, and we just use that. So with or and with as well as, we just use one subject or the other. With as well as, it's always a particular one we use. With or, it depends on their placement. With an and, that actually compiles and becomes they. That's the only subject-verb agreement skills that I would recommend having down if you are not going to do English 3, if you are not worried necessarily about those points. If I planned it that way, I probably planned it that way for a reason. So if it's crossed out on your plan, you certainly can add anything back in that you want to at any time. So anything I take off a plan, you can always put it back on. However, if I have it crossed off, I thought about that in context of something with your situation, how much time you have, how much money you're willing to put into it, what kind of score you're looking for. Typically, that's the one, the score is the one that really influences whether you do those little tricky, difficult classes or not. So if I have English 3 crossed off and you want to do subject-verb agreement, just let me know that you want to buy it. If I have it crossed off and you don't, just use this little practice set. There's several more practices that you can do, and just master and, or, and as well as, and then regular verbs. Just a side note right here. Hold on. Right here, this very, very last one, cross it out because it's an accidental copy paste from up above. So the very, very, very last one on the very last page, don't do that because you've already done those examples a little bit ahead of that. Once you are done with this class, of course, there will be a key so that you can check all your work. The goal of this class is to remember all the things you're supposed to be ready to answer, but also to start thinking of them together and start having these kind of indicators that are located in the different sentences that are really able to help influence how you answer your questions. So let me know if you have any specific questions. Again, also use your English 1 and 2 classes. Certainly, if you are doing English 3, you will need to go back to that because I didn't go in detail with that here. But don't rely just on the intense review at any given time. Always rely on that and your original courses, your original packets. Get as much practice as possible here. Use your practice for everything that you possibly can as far as you know, recognizing things that aren't a subject at hand, but they are there for you to see and for you to mess with. And then let me know once you kind of master everything, you get all your work done, you go back to your classes a bit, if there are specific questions that I can still answer. So that is it for Intense English. I will see you later.